Welcome to today's webinar on cultural inclusion and leadership in today's workforce. My name is Alexandra Stevens, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Career Programs here at the Hyatt Career Center at Brandeis, and I'm so excited to welcome you today to talk about this very important topic for the next hour. I wanted to introduce our presenter to you, Dena Samuels. She is an assistant professor in women's and ethnic studies at the University of Colorado's campus in Colorado Springs, and she recently received the university's Outstanding Instructor Award. She is also director of UCCS's Matrix Center for the Advancement of Social Equity and Inclusion. And through her consulting firm, she provides seminars and consultation to schools, campuses, and organizations on the processes of integrating diversity and building inclusiveness. Her book has already sold out its first run, and now it's in its second printing. It's called The Culturally Inclusive Educator, Preparing for a Multicultural World. And that book offers transformative strategies for building cultural inclusiveness. As a yogi myself, I loved hearing this. She also serves as a culturally inclusive and trauma-sensitive yoga instructor. She has a PhD in educational leadership, research, and policy from UCCS, an MA in Sociology, also from UCCS, and a BA in Politics from Brandeis. So excited to have you here, Dena, fellow Brandeis alum, talking with alumni today about these very important topics. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It is an honor to be here, especially for my alma mater. That's very exciting. I do this work all over the country, but I'm very excited to, again, my alma mater is that's near and dear to my heart, obviously, even though it's been a minute since I lived there. I would like to start off today by asking you to consider this idea of what exclusion looks like in our lives. So when we think about inclusion, it's nice to start with exclusion to have a base of understanding. So considering a time that you felt excluded in your life and what that felt like. So if you can think of a time either in your life or in your workplace, preferably, thinking about what that brings up for you. What I always say about this work is the fact that when we think about cultural inclusion, it's really hard work. It's not just hard work, it's also heart work. It's work that we need to be thinking about in terms of what emotions come up along the way. And so when we think about exclusion, what does that feel like in our bodies? A lot of the work I do is embodied engagement, thinking, really feeling through these ideas. And I think that that's really important in terms of there's so much more information we have in our bodies that, messages that our bodies will send us, that if we don't pay attention to that, we're losing information. So that's why I think it's important to connect with our bodies on these issues. And then thinking about a time you felt included, and think about what that felt like. And just if you even take a moment to do that, you'll see the difference of that going from exclusion to inclusion. That feeling of inclusion tends to be much warmer and feels like you're here, you're in the room, you belong. And that's really the goal. When I think about this work, I think about the fact that we think we are prepared to build cultural inclusiveness in our organizations and across campuses around the United States, and I would say around the world. We think we are prepared to build cultural inclusiveness, but my book actually is based on the research that I did, which was national research, which showed that educators from around the country believe they are prepared to build cultural inclusiveness. And yet when I asked them a series of questions about their behavioral outcomes, so things that were best practices that I culled from all over the US and beyond to consider what does it mean to build, to be culturally inclusive, overwhelmingly the answer to those questions were, no, I don't do that, no, I don't do that, no, I don't do that. So we think we're culturally inclusive, we think we're prepared to build cultural inclusion, we are not doing what it takes to build cultural inclusion. And then when I asked the question, have you had any meaningful education in this area? The answer overwhelmingly was no. And so therefore, people think, there's a disconnect there, right? We're not culturally inclusive. We've had very little education. There's no standard, national standard, certainly not in this country. There's no national standard for requirement for teachers, educators, leaders to build cultural inclusiveness. So why do we think we are good at it and that we're prepared for it? There is absolutely a disconnect there. And so what we need to think about is that people answer that question. When I ask that question often, why do we think we are prepared? The answer I get most often is, well, I'm a good person, so clearly I'm culturally inclusive. But we know the data shows us something different, right? We know there's what I call an opportunity gap. Many in my field are switching over from achievement gap, which seems like it's a blaming the victim kind of situation, to an opportunity gap, that idea that who are we giving the opportunities to and who is missing out, who has access and who doesn't. That's really the question. And there's a huge gap between those who are feeling included, who are being welcomed into organizations, and those who aren't. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. This is my goal and the intention that I have for every organization that I walk into when I'm consulting is to make every member feel like they belong. Because if you think about it, when you belong, when you have that sense of inclusion, when you feel like you belong, you now are no longer worried about what are other people thinking of you, or at least not as much, right? That part kind of fades away, and what you're feeling more of is you're bringing your whole self into the room. And when we do that, we can actually soar. We can actually go from someone who feels like an outsider to feeling like what I'm saying, what I'm bringing to the table is welcomed and valued. And that's my goal, because our organizations will soar at the same time. So as we go through the presentation today, we all have different funds of knowledge. Some people have come to diversity and inclusiveness work as a brand new person. Like, everybody has their social identities that they bring into the room and their experiences. And so I want to honor that, especially when we talk about inclusiveness. But also thinking about your funds of knowledge. What do you know well in terms of social identities? These are just a few, right, that we have. But what do we believe we know well? So in our society, for example, there aren't many people who are really feel like they've got the ideas, the notions, the background, the understanding around, for example, disability, right? You may have studied race and ethnicity, you may have studied sexuality, you may have really engaged in those areas. But if you don't know somebody who has been living with a disability, or you would call yourself non-disabled right now, you may not have had the experience to understand what a life living with a disability might look like, whether it's a visible disability or an invisible disability. And so be thinking about what you know well, and also what we don't know well, right? What don't we know? And so that's a good way to start out thinking about this work and having our minds on that. This is my book, The Culturally Inclusive Educator, Preparing for a Multicultural World. In it, I talk about 8 transformative steps for building cultural inclusiveness. And so this is basically half of chapter 5 in the book. And so what we're going to do today is to quickly kind of give an overview of some of the questions that I ask in the book. The book is very much, it gives some background, gives a lot of understanding and grounding in a lot of cultural inclusiveness and diversity ideas, ideology, and theory. But really the bulk of the book goes into strategies. And the strategies are framed they're framed as questions. they're questions that we have not often been given the opportunity to answer. And especially when I think about, I mean, I call it the culturally inclusive educator. It's really the culturally inclusive leader. I mean, that's really what I wanted to call it. And I had a nice challenge with my editor and publisher, the Columbia University's Teachers College Press. And you know, you challenge those, you make those challenges, and sometimes you win and sometimes you don't. And so this is what they chose to call it, the culturally inclusive educator. But really, it's being used as book club books for not only on campuses, but also in K-12 schools, as well as in organizations around the US. And so people are getting the fact that the questions that I'm asking aren't just for in the classroom, they really are for organizations as well. And so we're going to go through these 8 steps, and really it's 8 questions that I'm asking along the way. The first step is discovering our own biases. And so the question I have for you all is, what is implicit bias? And the way I'm going to ask you the question is, are you familiar with the term? Is that a notion that you're aware of? And so I'm going to ask Alexandra to actually take that poll now. How many of you are familiar with that idea?
Yeah, absolutely. So quick poll on your screen. Feel free to be honest, and then Dena, I'm sure you will explain this in further detail as well. So just a couple seconds, quick yes or no. Are you familiar with this notion? And then we'll be back to you. So it looks like most folks have weighed in, so I'm going to go ahead and close the poll and share those results with you. Nice participatory group, thank you, love this. So it looks like 78% have heard of it and about a quarter have not.
Okay, perfect, thank you so much, Alexandra, I appreciate that. So when we think about implicit bias, I'm going to go over it briefly, and it'll be a review, obviously, for some of you. But then taking it a step further in why is that important? Okay, so implicit bias is this idea. There we go. They are unconscious ideas we have about others, right? And so this is often based on stereotypes. And again, implicit bias happens so quickly that we almost can't catch it because it happens so quickly. And I'm going to challenge that in a moment. But when we think about implicit bias or unconscious bias, it happens really, really fast. I do a lot of work in implicit bias. I do an implicit bias workshop that allows people to understand not only what's happening in their brain, but how quickly it happens and what it takes to actually challenge it. And I'm going to give some a couple of ideas about that here. This is the important piece about implicit bias, and this is why I think it's important and why I bring it into this work, is that it can cause exclusion even unintentionally. And so the idea that we could be intentionally, we think we are intentional about social justice or about cultural inclusiveness, and our biases can get in the way of that. And so that, again, that's why it's important. The good news is that they can be changed once we're aware of them. So we are not stuck with what we've got.
So Dena, just a quick question for you. Are you using, or can you use implicit bias interchangeably with unconscious bias?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great.
Implicit bias is also known as unconscious bias. So same thing. Thank you. So the next question I have is, so Harvard University has this project Implicit, where it's you take this 5-minute test on screen, and it needs to be on a computer, and you're pressing one key or another based on the directions on the screen. And so I wanted to pause here and ask how many of you have taken an implicit association test?
Okay, so another quick poll. This sounds really interesting. I personally have not taken one, but I'm certainly going to follow that link to do so. Have you taken an IAT before? Or yes, no, are you not quite sure? And I'm sure you'll go into more detail about that. A couple more seconds to weigh in. And then I will share the results. So Dena, looks like about half and half.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Okay, good. So I'm going to talk about that just for a moment. The thing that I like about, like, the IAT has gotten some challenges for sure. It is not a perfect test, but given that there are now roughly 500 different peer-reviewed journal articles that use this test to measure implicit bias, tells me that it is much more useful than not. And to unpack what's going on in our brains, that it's really hard to unpack. We think we know, we think we might be able to say what our implicit biases are, but the truth is until we take a test like this, it's really hard to know for sure. And so what this does is it pulls out of our brains very quickly in a 5-minute span how biased we are on a particular topic. And so when you go to this link, basically you'll have a choice of a ton of different social identities, tests on various social identities. There's tests on race, gender, sexuality, poverty, social class. There's just most of the things you can think of are on, they've created a test for. And this is, again, Harvard University's Project Implicit who's done this. The thing that I love about it is that it is based on a subject pool of 5 million people. And when you think about it, we don't have a subject pool like that for anything. So the fact that we can compare our results with 5 million people means that it's definitely a robust test, right? And just to think about the fact that, it may, even if people are challenging it for various reasons, most of it is how it's being employed, how it's being used once people take it. That tends to be where the problem is. That's where the challenges come in. The test itself is absolutely the most efficient way we have today to learn what our biases are. And the key here is that we need to know what our biases are if we want to change them. And so here's what I often get. This is the fear. Some people will say when they have a reaction to the test, this is, but I'm not racist, and my test showed that I have a strong preference for whites over blacks. And they'll say, but I'm not racist. And I'll say, yes, that's true. That may be so, but something else is going on in your brain that this test is showing. It's just giving us information. The way I like to think about it is that we are all, let me go back for a second. We've all learned racist messages. And this test shows how deeply those messages have stuck. So, for example, when I give the test out to my students, which I do every semester, when I give it out to workshop participants, I say the same thing. I don't care what your results are. I care what you're going to do with them. I need you to know what those results are, right? And the truth is, if it does show that you have more of a tendency to prefer whites over blacks in this example, that doesn't necessarily mean you're racist. It means that you have been a really good learner of the racist messages we have learned in our society, right? That there's so many racist messages. We get sexist messages, heterosexist messages, ableist messages, ageist messages. And all it means is you've been a really good learner. You've been a good learner of our society. And so here are the questions that I ask typically. What did you expect your results to be? What is your reaction to your results? Because some people show a lot of surprise, concern about what they've got. And then really ultimately is, what can you do with this knowledge? And I love this James Baldwin quote, "We can't fix what we won't face." And so this is an idea, it is a personal challenge for you to really consider what is it you don't know, because that's really what we're looking at here. In terms of cultural inclusiveness, that's the question we need to be asking. What is it we don't know? And we need to make the invisible visible so that we can proceed, and we can maybe challenge some of the things we've learned, challenge some of the systems that we live in, etc. That's the social justice part of this. One thing I will say is that if you have not taken an IAT, please start with the race one. And I say that because it is the one that they'll take anything else. If I don't give them a choice, they'll take anything but the race one, because they don't want to know how, where their implicit biases are around race. They don't want to consider themselves racist. And so I always say, please start with the race one. And what's interesting is it's typically white folks who are the ones who are most afraid to take the race one. So I challenge you to start with that one, with the link that I gave. The second step is asking the question. It's reflecting on our socialization. Socialization is, I'm a sociologist, so it's how do we know what we know? That it really is what socialization is. What have we learned? What has society taught us to know? And thinking about this, it's sort of unpacking the stereotypes that we have been taught. So asking this step 2, reflecting on our socialization, is to think about, where did those stereotypes come from? Oftentimes we can focus on this notion of confirmation bias, which, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the topic, the idea of confirmation bias, it's the idea that the stereotypes that we believe are true because we've been taught that they're true are consistently confirmed by us. So we see something that follows our stereotype and we believe it again. It's reinforced. Whereas those things that would challenge that bias or that stereotype go in one ear and out the other. We don't even pay attention to it. And once again, our bias or our stereotype is confirmed one more time. So unpacking that, how did we learn what we know? How do we know what we know? What are those stereotypes that we have bought into? And again, not intentionally. This is not a blame game. This is not, you're a bad person for believing the stereotype. It is our society has taught us these stereotypes, and we have oftentimes through no fault of our own bought into the stereotypes, again, without even knowing that we've done so. So a lot of this is unpacking that. Okay. Moving on, I want to get to step 3, which is challenging the assumptions we have. So the example that I like to use oftentimes when I think about a stereotype is we have a stereotype about people in our society who have blonde hair and their intelligence. And when you think about this logically, why would the color of your hair on your head have anything to do with what's inside your head? Really, it makes no sense that we do that. And yet, this is a stereotype that we have that is played out over and over again in US society. And thinking about that, it's an assumption we make about someone's intelligence based on what they look like. And so if we take this as we think about confirmation bias that we were just talking about, you take someone with blonde hair, they appear to you read them as having less intelligence, that confirms the bias, right? And then if you meet somebody who seems highly intelligent who happens to have blonde hair, you don't even notice their blonde hair. Like, that goes away. And so it confirms, again, reinforcing the stereotype that you had, that you continue to believe. You don't even, it doesn't change. You have to go out of your way to really focus on the fact that, oh, this is a person with blonde hair who is intelligent. Once I do that, I am now starting the process of challenging my implicit bias. That's how that works. So how do we challenge our assumption? And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Byron Katie's work, but she doesn't necessarily do diversity and inclusiveness work. But when I read her work, she's got a book called The 4 Questions, and I thought, oh, this fits perfectly. And the questions, when I mention them, you may not know her name, but you may think, oh, I've heard these questions before. And I thought they were perfect for this idea that we're talking about here. And then, but it wasn't enough. I wanted to add one. The first question she asks is the assumption or idea true? Right? So we can say, you know, is the assumption about people who have blonde hair that, you know, have less intelligence, is that true? And we may look back in our own experience and say, well, every person with blonde hair that I can think of is not as intelligent. So we may actually answer that by saying yes, because again, unpacking it, we know that's confirmation bias. So, but yet in our experience, we may believe that it's true. The second question she asks is, can we absolutely know that it is true? And almost without fail, that answer is always going to be no. Can we absolutely know that it is true? There's no way we could say that every single blonde person on the planet, you know, person with blonde hair is less intelligent than those with darker hair. Like there's no way we can know that that is true. And so that answer to that, and I'm using this as an example, obviously you can put in any other stereotype you like. The third question she asks is, what happens in our bodies, in our interactions, in our emotions when we believe that the stereotype or this notion is true? When we believe this notion is true, think about what happens when a person with blonde hair walks towards you, what your immediate assumptions are, what those implicit biases that might be coming up, that might be cued, might do to your interaction with the person, right? So what happens, that's the question, is what happens when we believe this idea? And then her fourth question, Byron Katie's fourth question is, what would be different if we let go of that idea? What would be different? How could things be different? What would that interaction look like if we let go of the idea, that notion, that, you know, that assumption, the stereotype, whatever it is that we have bought into? And she ends there. What I have added to it is the fifth question is, what can we replace it with? What notion or idea can we replace it with? And this, again, is a great way of challenging implicit bias. We need to have, maybe it's an affirmation about all people being intelligent in their own way. Maybe it's an affirmation about, you know, it has to be positive. We know from social psych research that it needs to be a positive affirmation. Negative affirmations don't work very well because our brain actually only hears the positive side of that, and so it gets confusing. So the idea is to replace your assumption with something positive, a positive affirmation. And studies have shown that if we challenge those notions, challenge those assumptions on the spot, and we can think of what those are in advance, if we know what our assumptions are. John Powell talks about this as counter stereotypic examples. So if you have an idea, a bias in your mind, and you know this in advance because you've taken your implicit association test from Harvard's Project Implicit, and you know, oh, I have a bias against this particular group of people, I can now go I can think ahead. Oh, the next time I see somebody from that group, or I'm about to interact with somebody from that group, I can think of this counter stereotypic example, somebody who doesn't fit the standards of what the stereotype is in my head, that holds that identity. And studies have shown that if you call that counter stereotypic example up in your head right before you interact with someone from that group, your interaction will be much more authentic. It's like 180 degrees different kind of interaction, much more positive. So this is one of the ways we can challenge implicit bias and our own assumptions in our heads. And that's one way for doing that. If we're moving on to step 4, it's the idea of reflecting on our own identities. This is the part that gets a little deeper in terms of, we want to consider first off to think about, how do you describe yourself? And if we had tons of time, which I typically have more time than this, so I'm going to ask you to think about this, is how you might describe yourself, especially to someone who doesn't know you. How would you describe yourself? Chances are very good that you're going to talk about your personality traits. You're going to talk about the fact that, you know, you like to ski, or you love swimming, or maybe you'll say you're a mom, or you're a underwater diver, you know, deep sea diver, or something like that. Your activities, some of the things, maybe some of the identities you have in your life in terms of your roles that you take on. That is different than this. These are some of your social identities that we use, that other people might use to describe you. And if you look at this list, you'll see age and race and ethnicity and gender, physical abilities or qualities, sexuality, your education, work, income, all of these things, right? We have lots of different social identities that we use to describe each other. And the reason that I bring this into the conversation is because oftentimes we are much more, when we think about ourselves, we're so much more complex. Our identities are so much more complex than the ways people might describe us. So although I may describe myself as I like to sing and play guitar, and I have all kinds, you know, I'm a yogi, you know, I'm a yoga instructor, etc. Someone else might describe me by my social identities as being white, a gender conforming female, cisgender, if you will. You know, they might look at me and make some assumptions about my identities. And so this is important in terms of not only how we see ourselves, but how other people might see us. Because when we're unpacking and we're reflecting on our own identities, this has a huge impact on how we interact with other folks and how inclusive we're being. And so when you think about how you might identify yourself versus how somebody else might identify you, you have to, it's important to notice the contrast, that there might be a difference there. And these identities, the impact of our identities are dependent on our settings and circumstances, how we are, where we are, which identities are cued based on the room that we're in and who else is in that room, and how our identities align with what is considered normal, accepted, and therefore privileged. And so some of you may be very familiar with the idea, the concept of social privilege. And I'm just going to touch on that briefly here, just to give you a clue into why this question might be important. So here are some social identities, how you might identify yourself. So on the left side of the screen is, you know, gender, race, ethnicity, social class, religion, spirituality, sexual orientation, disability. And on the right are some, just a laundry list of different ways you might identify yourself. I'm going to just go over a couple that some people might not know what they are, might not be familiar with them. So the first one for gender, by the way, is cisgender, C-I-S, it's spelled cisgender, which cisgender is a term that some people know, some people are less familiar with. It's becoming more common in our vernacular nowadays, but cis comes from the Greek, meaning on the same side of. And so when we say, if I identify as cisgender, it means that my gender expression, the way people perceive my gender, matches the gender, how I identify my gender myself. So my gender is on the same side of the way I present my gender, or the way people see my gender. So that would be cisgender, as opposed to transgender or genderqueer. These are just various ways that people like to identify themselves, or even prefer to identify themselves. For, if you look down the list, biracial, multiracial, etc., for social class, working class, poor, lower middle income, etc. Going down to sexual orientation, I often I'm asked what pansexual is compared to, for example, bisexual. We know bisexual is having an attraction for both males and females. Pansexual is typically that your sexuality, your attraction is based less on gender than on how someone shows up to you, or, you know, their personality might come through more so than how important their gender is. So it's a little bit of a broader range. It's a little bit more of a spectrum, an attraction on a spectrum. Disability, there's some words here that just to make sure people know. PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder. It's also called post-traumatic stress, PTS nowadays. TBI is traumatic brain injury. So I'm just going over this list because these are the questions I typically get. I love the idea of, this is from Alan Johnson's work. He wrote a book called Privilege, Power, and Difference, and he identifies as temporarily non-disabled because you never know, right? Like, who knows what will happen. And eventually, we'll probably all have some sort of disability in our lives. So keeping that in mind as well. So looking at these social identities, I think are really important in terms of thinking about who we give privilege to in the United States. And some of these I would argue we could give privilege to around the world. But I am specifically talking about the United States here. For race, in the United States, when we think about who we give privilege to, which identities are generally privileged, for race, we think about white. For gender, it's male. For social class, I would say middle to upper. For sexual orientation, heterosexual. For religion, it would be Christian. Physical ability would be non-disabled, as Alan Johnson would put it, or some folks might say strong. For mental ability, able or smart. Now, age is always an interesting one. I look at it as a bell curve. If you are too young in our society, you don't know anything. And if you're too old, you don't know anything. And there's some group right in the middle that we give privilege to, right? And so I have some numbers here. So please don't yell and scream. But I have some numbers here that I think are rough. Somewhere between 25 and 55. And notice here too that those might be different based on whether you're male, how your gender, how you identify on your gender, based on your gender, so that it may go up higher for males than it would for females. That's just, this is who is given privilege in our society. And then education, I have formally educated. And so just to note very quickly that there is, when you look at this list, there are only a few pieces here that are arguably inherently powerful. So I might say that, for example, I'm an educator, so I would say education is power, right? So that maybe that's where power would come from. You might say money is power, so being middle to upper class might give you some power. But if you look at, for example, race, there is really nothing inherently powerful about white skin. And in fact, you could make the opposite claim that the more melanin you have in your skin, the more protected you are from the sun. And so therefore, this really, all of many of these are really socially constructed, right? They've been socially constructed. And also know that if you are a very small part of the population who actually might fit all of these categories, these privileged categories, know that first of all, I could probably add a whole bunch more social identities here that would pull you out of that privileged category anyway. But at the same time, look at the age that even if you do fit all of these categories, eventually you're going to grow out of it, right? As you get older. So the key here is to really think about how each of these play out. So for me, I have white skin, so I gain white skin privilege in our society. I am given the benefit of the doubt. We'll look at what that looks like in a moment. But my gender identify as female, and am identified as female. And I know as a female, even though I might feel privileged to be female, I at the same time, I know I'm going to be, statistically speaking, in US especially, but really worldwide, I'm going to be more likely to be the victim of sexual assault, domestic violence. I'm going to make less in my lifetime than my counterparts who have a different gender identity, who are male. So that's sort of how that operates. And thinking about how we experience privilege has a lot to do with inclusion here. If I'm given the benefit of the doubt, if I'm given insider status, I'm going to feel included no matter where I go, no matter what situation I walk into. And if I, by chance, walk into a situation where I am the only white person in the room and I am, treated differently or something based on my skin color, I know that I can, if let's say I go into a restaurant where it's primarily folks of color in the room, I can walk down the street and go pretty much anywhere else and be the insider, right? I have that. That's what happens in the United States, especially with white skin, overwhelmingly. Your identities are assumed to be the norm. It's an unearned advantage that I was born with that I did not earn. This is a challenge often for some folks because they might say, well, I don't have any privilege because I may be white, but I grew up poor. And I got where I got because, I worked really hard. And I don't want to argue with that. I think that's absolutely true. There are many white folks who have worked incredibly hard to get where they are in society. And all I can say is to think about it from a broader perspective. What if you had that exact same life and you were a person of color? Would you have gotten as far as you are today if you were a person of color with those same circumstances? So it's really thinking about this on a much broader scale. And then just know that we can't opt out of privilege. It is systemic. I may say I don't want the white privilege that I'm being given. I don't want to be given the benefit of the doubt over someone else, like it's not fair. But I can't opt out of it. It is the system. We did not necessarily create it, but we are living in it. And so we are definitely part of it. There's another piece to this, which is that privilege, the system of privilege, is embedded in society. It's assumed, it's unnamed, and it's invisible. The example I like to give is, I'll give that in a second, but it's deeply rooted. And so, like I said, we didn't create it, but it is here, right? It's entrenched, right? And it serves to preserve the power hierarchy. It gives privilege to some and at the expense of others. So thinking about how do we benefit from the privileges we have, if you pick one of the social identities in which you have privilege, how does that play out in your life? What does that mean you get that someone else might not, based on your social identity, based on that status, right? So think about how do we make our privileged identities transparent to others, which actually creates inclusion. So as a white person, I may say, I may walk into a space with folks of color, and if I can acknowledge my whiteness in the room in some way, I am all of a sudden calling people into the conversation, as opposed to if I ignore it, right? I am creating exclusion. People think I'm just another white person who doesn't really understand the privilege that I have, right? And so making that transparent actually creates inclusion. And that's why I go through that whole process of understanding privilege for those of you who may be less familiar with it or may have challenged it in the past, just knowing that it's a system that we live in, and thinking about how does it operate in terms of cultural exclusion and cultural inclusion. So that's why I bring it into this conversation. Moving right along, in the last couple of minutes, I want to get through the last couple of steps that we go through. Thinking about our emotions, which emotions arise when we think about folks who have different social identities than we do. So for example, if you're noticing your emotions when you think about people in poverty, what comes up for you, right? What about people with disabilities? What about transgender individuals? Now, if you have exposure to these folks on a regular basis, your emotions may be very different to somebody who, in our society in general, who does not have access to or does not have relationship with folks in any of these categories. So think about what that would mean in terms of what emotions come up. Is there some fear there, right? Is there pity? Is there confusion? And what does that mean in terms of your reaction to somebody in one of these categories, in any of these categories, and we could make the list a whole lot longer here. And knowing that if we can consider our emotions in that moment when we are in front of somebody with who has an identity that's different from ours that we're not accustomed to, what comes up, and if we can acknowledge what's coming up for us and accept those emotions, we can actually transform our interaction in terms of responding rather than reacting to the person. And again, if we know what our implicit biases are, we are more likely to respond to a person who we know who we have an implicit bias against versus to react. Moving on, step 6 is reflecting on our own behavior. And so I want to ask this question: how have our false beliefs, our assumptions, and stereotypes affected our behavior? What are some of the ways we might be unintentionally including some people and excluding others? This leads us to this notion of microaggressions. And so I'm going to ask if we can see, and we can ask that question in general.
Yeah, so again, quick poll. Are you familiar with the term microaggressions? I actually saw a really interesting cartoon video talking about microaggressions that really hit it home for me, but it is kind of a difficult term to understand sometimes. So a couple more seconds to weigh in, and then we'll share the results. So Brandeis Group, no surprise here. Most folks, yes, have heard about them, but a couple haven't. So for those that haven't.
Okay, great. And we only have a couple more minutes, so I'm just gonna go through pretty quickly. But thinking about this term, they are the way Dr. Daryl Wing Su describes them is as paper cuts. He says, you hear something, your identity is cued along the way in the morning when you leave the house, and some identity that typically stereotypes is cued. Somebody says something, you feel like it's a paper cut. You sit there and you think, do I have the time to respond or don't I? And if I don't, I'm going to move, I'm going to move on. And unfortunately, when that happens, they go unchallenged. But of course, that puts the onus on the person who is being microaggressed against to constantly be speaking up. And that gets very, very old. There are subtle words, cues, behaviors that invalidate or exclude others. They're almost always in spite of good intentions. So you may have a great intention of saying something lovely to someone and giving them a compliment even, and really the underlying message is something very negative. They can be easily brushed off by some, just thinking, oh, in other words, the microaggressor will brush them off saying, oh, I was just kidding, right? But unfortunately for the person who receives them, there are long-term effects, stress, physiological stress, anxiety, depression. Those who are on the receiving end of microaggressions over the course of their lifetime literally have higher mortality rates. This is, incredible. Like when we think about how brutal microaggressions can be, even when they seem so subtle in the moment. And so one of the ones that I hear all the time that I feel, and I have actually I wrote a journal article on this that's about to be published on this notion of colorblindness. It's typically out of the mouths of white folks that we hear, I don't see color, we're all the same. This is a microaggression known as colorblindness. The intended message is positive. It's, I'm not racist, I don't, but because it's out of a white person's mouth who we hear this from, why are you saying that to a person of color? Clearly you're not colorblind, right? If you see the person's color. So literally you're starting a relationship that's based on an inauthentic, interaction, right? You're actually lying. You do see color, right? The underlying message here is that race doesn't matter when we know it does. I mean, underneath our skin, we are almost identical, right? We know that. However, that doesn't mean skin color is not incredibly paramount in our society. We can even just look at the Black Lives Matter movement and all of that to know there's something going on here that is really important we need to focus on. Some people will say, I'd rather be colorblind, but really what it boils down to is to say race doesn't matter, really is to say you don't matter. Your experiences don't matter. And this is very problematic. Not only that, but it also says my white skin doesn't matter. And then I can ignore my white privilege. If I can be colorblind, I don't have to deal with the fact that I have white privilege in this society that I didn't earn, right? The impact is we are not treated equally. Race does matter, and you're basically saying you don't see that. And so colorblindness and ignoring differences in general is not the answer. It ignores systemic racism. It perpetuates the idea that to notice or even talk about race is racist, which is not the case. It unfortunately whitewashes our society in general, and it considers intent, not impact, as important. And we don't call it micro intentions, we call it microaggressions for a reason. It does have a very, very strong impact. So learning what we don't know is really critically important. Think about what other microaggressions might be happening in the workplace by you or someone else. How can you acknowledge them? How can you challenge them very gently with compassion? And how can we learn more and disrupt them? Okay, moving along, step 7 is considering our purpose, considering the why of what we're doing. Why are we looking at cultural inclusiveness? Why is this important? It can't just be for other folks. We can't just say, well, it's the right thing to do because, you know, I want to be an anti-racist activism for other people, right? No, you have to do it because if it's just for other people, you might get busy and not pursue that area. You may not pursue those goals. Whereas if you can consider why are you doing this for you? How, for example, how as a white person, I need to ask the question, how does the fact that racism exists in this country and in this world, how does it negatively affect me, right? I know that I'm gaining from white privilege, right? Because I'm going to be included, right? I'm going to be given the benefit of the doubt. Those might be the benefits. What are the drawbacks? What is the problem? Why is it so critically important? For me, I know personally that it creates separation. Racism creates separation between people. That has hurt me in my life personally. Now, I'm not suggesting here that racism hurts white folks more than it hurts folks of color, not at all. But I do think it's important for white folks to reflect on why racism matters, why it's something that we all need to challenge. Why do I need to challenge it for myself? And I know I've used race a lot here, but we could also put in why does sexism hurt males? Why does heterosexism hurt heterosexuals, etc.? So looking at this from an intersectional perspective is really important. And the last step is committing to this work, thinking about how sustainable is the work we're doing, how long do you expect it to go on, knowing that it's a lifelong process. And that's a critically important question to be asking because it's not just for today or tomorrow, it's for the long haul. And so some basic strategies just to review, knowing your own biases is the first step, taking the IAT, thinking about not only recruitment of people from traditionally marginalized identities, but also retention. What is the culture we're building? Thinking about different kinds of biases we have in the workplace and how, as leaders, we need to challenge these biases. I talked about the idea of coming up with counter-stereotypic examples. John Powell calls that priming. This idea that we can challenge those implicit biases that we have. Challenging colorblindness, acknowledging that differences do exist, learning more about what we don't know. Here's a key: be willing to make mistakes and show up again and again and again. We can't possibly know about all the differences about every single person and their cultures. We're going to make mistakes. So acknowledging we're going to make mistakes and showing up anyway, even once we've made them, apologizing and moving on. And finally, building relationships with people who are different from you, is critically important. To me, that's the antidote to inequalities. Asking yourself in every situation, in every room you walk into, who is in this room, who is not in this room, whose voice is being heard, whose voices are missing from the conversation, and more importantly, why? And what can I do about that? Building inclusiveness will enrich your life. It will foster connection rather than keeping us separate, and it'll create spaces where everyone feels like they belong, including you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dena. That was a lot to cover in the last 55 minutes, so I so appreciate you being with us. Now we are opening it up to questions for folks, so if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them through the GoToWebinar question box. First question for you, Dena. What advice would you have for someone as a next step if they want to change the culture in their own workplace? I was actually just talking with a friend of mine a couple weeks ago who started up just out of her own volition and talking with a couple coworkers, a diversity and inclusion initiative at her own company, and now it's one of the most rewarding parts of her job. What advice would you give to folks who want to take some action in the workplace?
So the first thing I would do is I would try to find people who are like-minded, who believe that cultural inclusion is important and culturally inclusive leadership is important. I would probably focus on the word leadership more and more. I feel like if that word is left off, people don't make the connection that that is in fact leadership. So that would be where I would start, getting together a coalition of folks, bringing them together, having conversations, maybe doing a lunchtime connection, put up signs around your organization that says, hey, if you want to have a conversation around this topic, and then get a group together, see if there's any buy-in from the leadership in the organization. Thinking about a strategic plan, a diversity and inclusiveness strategic plan would be absolutely the way I would go. The consulting work that I do, actually, I can help you with that if that's something that you're interested in. And then the diversity strategic plan is an overall, it's sort of like a blueprint for how you're going to create, build and sustain a culturally inclusive initiative in your organization. It can't just be a one-stop shop. It has to be, or as I call it, honestly, is drive-by diversity training, because that can do more harm than good. It needs to be a well-thought-out plan that's organized and that has follow-through, and hopefully, most importantly, has buy-in from the senior leadership in the organization.
Great points. And that's related to our next question that we have here. So where can folks go to learn more and to learn more about offering trainings? This listener is particularly interested in resources to help talk to white people who are potentially unaware of these issues. And so, we see this too. I feel like the people who come to trainings out of their own volition are the ones that do have some self-awareness and understand the problem. How do you engage others? What other resources would you recommend for folks?
Sure. So I do have some resources on my my website, denasamuels.com, that might be helpful since I know we don't have a ton of time. So that might be useful. There's so many. There's conferences to go to that are highlighted on my resources page. And in local communities, there are specifically working around with white folks is the SURGE organization, Standing Up for Racial Justice. That's community activism, but there may be some, if you want to do some local stuff there, that getting involved that way may be helpful. They would also have some local resources as well.
Okay, great. Another listener brought up an interesting point related to IATs. So this listener uses them in training frequently, and she actually advises people to take another test before the race one so that they can practice responding. So it's especially helpful for people who are less comfortable with computers so that they get an accurate assessment while taking those IATs. So I thought that was an interesting point just to bring up.
Thank you so much. That's a really great point. As long as they're willing to take the race as one of them.
Yes, yeah. Noted. Absolutely. So again, our hour has come to a close here. Any final thoughts, Dena, before we go into just a couple housekeeping items for folks?
I really want to thank you so much, Alexandra, for bringing me in. If I can be of service in any way to anyone's organizations or on a personal level, thinking about these things in a more complex way, I'm happy to do so. Just reach out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So if you could advance just to the next slide for me. For those of you still on the line, I wanted to let you know that we do these webinars every single month, and April is a bonus month. We actually have two. So in addition to today's, we have work-life balance is out, work compatibility is in, coming up at the end of the month on April 26th, talking about advocating for work-life flexibility. And so I hope that you'll all join us for that if that is something that you need. I think it's something we could all use a little bit more of. I also invite you to take our satisfaction survey to let us know how we did. We plan all of these webinars based on your feedback and based on the topics you want to hear about. So I welcome your feedback through that survey. You'll be getting it in the email later on this afternoon, which includes the link to the recording as well. I also want to remind you that Brandeis undergrad students and alumni get free access to career services through the Hyatt Career Center for life. And so please go ahead and contact us to schedule that. And also the next slide will give my contact information as well as our office if you have any feedback on additional types of alumni career programs you'd like to see either online or in a city near you. So again, from all of us at the Hyatt Career Center at Brandeis, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you, Dena. And I hope we'll see you all online again soon.
Thank you.